Okay, everyone. It's about 11:05 Central Time. So let's go ahead and get started this morning. Make sure we have the recording button on. I'm bad to forget that. 1 second. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, we will record the session. So if you need to step out for any reason, there's no problem. It won't disturb the rest of us, and we will record the session and post it sometime later today or early in the morning, so you can go ahead and watch the recording if you want to and catch up on anything you might have missed. All right now I have everybody muted, so you won't be able to speak to me. I'll unmute a little bit later on and see if you have any questions or any concerns. In the meantime, though, if you want to get a message to me, there's no problem. There's a little chat interface that you can use to send messages to me or other people that are attending the session today. I was just checking that to make sure that I didn't have any messages before I get started here. All righty, here's the agenda. It says that we'll meet approximately 2 hours. We may not need the entire 2 hours today. This session will just be an overview. We'll talk a little bit here about the differences between Genero and the old traditional 4GL that probably most of you are familiar with that are in this session today. A lot of our customers historically come from a 4GL programming environment, so we'll talk a little bit about the differences between Genero and the traditional 4GL applications. We'll also talk a little bit about the Genero architecture. It's very different from the way 4GL works. The entire architecture between the user interface and what we call the runtime system is completely different from how a compiled 4GL application would run and operate. So along with that, we'll talk about the possibilities with just recompiling your old 4GL application or a new Genero application for that matter and running it in different front-end environments. You can run a 4GL application that's been compiled to Genero in a desktop environment. We have a Genero desktop client for that. You can run it in a browser with the Genero web client. And we have some pre-configured, or we call them kind of default browser themes. Silverlight, Ajax, there's a new HTML5 theme that we'll talk about a little bit later that can be used by a Genero application server when it renders an application. And you can use these little themes out of the box as provided by Genero. You can customize them. You can even write your own from scratch if you prefer. So we'll talk quite a bit about the Genero web client and some of these themes that are used with those. So that's kind of our agenda today. One of the big focuses will be on the architecture and what we call this abstract user interface, or AUI, that makes it possible to compile an application and run it on any of these given front ends, like the desktop client or the web client, a mobile device, without having to recompile or recode the application to do it. So I mentioned already, if you need to leave the session for any reason, you can go ahead and do that. It won't bother anybody here. You can come back in and join again if you like. Or again, we'll be recording the session, so if you prefer or you get busy, you can always just watch the recorded session later on. And I'll try to get that posted as early as this afternoon, but at the latest, you should be able to find it out there by Wednesday morning. The plan is to go ahead and post the link to the recording where we did have the Register Now link on our instructor-led training page. If you attend the session and complete the session today, I believe you'll also get an email with that link in the email. I'll try to make sure I get it in there when the session ends. this is just a few little pictures here of the user interface that we're using for the training session. It's fairly straightforward. I doubt if anybody's having a real problem with it, but it probably doesn't hurt to go through it real quickly here just to make sure everybody's familiar with the interface and knows how to use it. So this little area here, let me grab a drawing tool real quick, is the viewing area where you're able to see my screen and see the PowerPoint slides here in a few minutes. You've also got a little control panel, they call it, right up here at the top that you can use to handle your own muting. Now right now I have you muted, so you don't have an option there to unmute yourself right now. But when I unmute you later on for questions, you can feel free to mute yourself if you prefer. Let's take a look. I think I've got another picture that's even better than this one, so that we can see. Yeah, here we go. This is the little control panel, a bigger view of the control panel. And you can open and hide your control panel with this little red arrow, this little box with the white arrow in it up here at the top. The audio, if you have trouble with voice over IP using the mic and speaker options, which is what I'm using, you can switch to the telephone option. And when you switch to that telephone option, you should see some connection information, a phone number that you can use to connect back to the session. There's the chat area down at the bottom that I've mentioned a few times. So feel free to use that chat area if you have any questions or have problems with the audio. I know a couple of times with this interface we've kind of inadvertently frozen the screen. And it's hard for me to tell that the screen's frozen, and I just assume that you're able to see all the PowerPoints as I change slides. But if for some reason that I accidentally freeze the screen or freeze my PowerPoints, feel free to send me a chat message or raise your hand. There's another option down here a little further down to raise your hand, and that will get my attention so that you can let me know that there's a problem with the interface or with the audio. And finally, there's the mute button again. Right now you wouldn't have an option probably to mute yourself because I have everyone muted. All right, so that's the little participation interface. It's fairly straightforward and simple to use. And before we get started here, let me just make sure I want to do one more little quick sound check just to make sure that everybody's able to hear me and maybe have you try out this interface a little bit. So everyone, do me a favor if you're listening, and if you can hear me okay, if the audio's good, click on your little raise hand icon. Excellent. Okay, I see a couple. Norma, Scott, Holly. Thank you very much. Okay, and I believe if you click on those little hand icons again, they'll go away. Thank you very much. It's always good to do a check every once in a while just to make sure you're still with me. All right. So we're starting out here with just a little bit of a reference to classic 4GL. I think a good place to start is kind of the history of Genero has traditionally been with 4GL customers. In fact, Genero BDL, the business development language that we'll be talking about in this session, is actually kind of a superset of 4GL. So I know several of you probably come from a classic 4GL environment and you're familiar with 4GL. And when you start looking at the code for BDL, the Genero language, you'll notice that it's very, very similar. However, there's a lot of really nice enhancements in BDL that we didn't have in 4GL. For example, we have all these great front ends that we're going to talk about today. The desktop client as well as a web client that we can use with mobile devices and web applications. We've got options with being able to show and hide things on the screen dynamically that we didn't have with 4GL. We have some built-in classes and methods we can use to manipulate objects on the screen. A lot of functionality with Genero BDL that we didn't see with 4GL. I don't normally do a lot of polls, but if you notice here this bullet that we have circled on the screen, it's talking about our traditional customer base. About half of our customers come from a 4GL background, 4 million active 4GL users. So traditionally that's been our biggest customers. So I'm a little bit curious, how many of you guys come from a 4GL or Informix 4GL background? I have a little poll here. Let me see if I can get this poll started. Oh, interesting. It's not letting me use the poll. I guess I'll have to try to do that maybe after the break today. Looks like I've lost my poll for some reason. I was just curious. We'll just use the hand instead. So do me a favor once again. Let me open up my little dashboard here. And if you have a 4GL background, do me a favor and raise your hand. All right. It's a little bit hard to tell without the poll interface, but it looks like a very large majority of the folks on this session come from a 4GL background. For you guys that are unable to see this, let me just tell you it's at least 90 to probably 95% of the folks here attending the session today come from a 4GL background, which is what we usually expect to see. So Genero's added a lot of language, a lot to the language, a lot of these new features that we were just talking about. So along with this kind of new architecture that we're going to talk about here in this session and a lot of these nice new features that we've added, we're also getting some kind of new types of customers that don't come from a traditional 4GL background, that just like the speed of developing new applications with Genero. They like the feature set. So we're starting to see some of that as well. So not all traditional 4GL customers. So since most of you do come from a 4GL background, this screen is going to look pretty familiar to most of you. This is our old traditional character-based screen, text-based screen that we see with 4GL. And this slide and the next slide, the one we see here, is kind of showing you a basic converted application. So this is the screen we saw in the previous slide, but now it includes a few Genero enhancements. Let me grab a little pen here so I can kind of point these out. So now our screen includes a top menu. We've got a couple of toolbars here. Uh-oh, David says he's not seeing the slide. 1 second, let me make sure I didn't accidentally. There we go. I think I inadvertently hit that little button. Is that better? Okay, thanks, David. Thank you guys that are sending me notes. I appreciate it. So, mentioned before, it's very easy for me to accidentally hit this little button that freezes my screen. So if I do that, those little notes from you guys are very helpful. All right, so let me kind of start from the top up here since I did freeze my screen. Up here at the top, this screen has been customized. It's been compiled to Genero BDL, or compiled to Genero. So we have a little top menu up at the top. We have a couple of little toolbars here. I draw those again. Down here, this is our screen array, but the array now is being displayed in something we call a table container. And these table containers have a lot of built-in features that we didn't see before. It doesn't look like a screen array in a text interface like we see in our old screens, our old character-based screens. With these table containers, the users have a lot of built-in functionality. They can go in, for example, and they can sort the data in the table. They can move these columns around if they want to. They can right-click, and there's going to be menus or options there if you allow them. They can show and hide columns. All of that, of course, can be controlled by you programmatically, but those are some of the features that kind of come built in to these new widgets, we'll call them, this one called a table container. So a lot of nice little built-in features. We've also can see here that we're grouping some fields here with folder tabs. This invoice journal area up here is being grouped in something called a group container. So this is just kind of a basic converted app, something that might look like if you recompiled a 4G app in Genero and did a little bit of customization. The folder tabs that we just saw would be some customization. The toolbars at the top menu, that would all be some customization. But you decide where and if any of these things are showing on the screen. Everything from the colors to the logo over here is customizable. This menu panel down here at the bottom is actually kind of the remnants of the old ring menu that we saw in our previous screen from the 4GL app. When you convert an application to Genero, ring menus are basically seen as actions that need to have some way to be triggered by the user. So they're all put together in a menu. And you can keep this menu, or you can move all the actions in the menu to a toolbar or up to one of these top menus if you prefer. Or you could even make buttons on the screen if you wanted to. Right? Not that my buttons look very good right now. But you have a lot of flexibility on how you want the application to look visually when you migrate 4GL app to Genero. Something else maybe to notice is that some of the actions are disabled, like all this stuff up here is disabled, and some are enabled. Right down here at the bottom, all of our menu buttons down at the bottom are enabled. That's just based on the running of the program. So as the user goes through the program and let's say he enters a menu block, for example, the menu actions are enabled. When he's not in a menu block, the menu options are disabled. All right. Alrighty, I just noticed, Scott, you have your hand up. Did you have a question or a comment? Okay, took it back down. Alright, so here I've got several pages here on just some additional language enhancements. We just saw some of the enhancements that we could use with things like form widgets, like table containers and so on. But here we've got some additional language enhancements. This first one that we're talking about is something called multiple dialogues. Multiple dialogues are just interactive dialogues like the construct, input array in 4GL that normally requires a user to either accept or cancel a dialogue before they can continue on through the form. And one of the cases during a migration when you might want to change the code to take advantage of some Genero features is with this feature called multiple dialogues. And the idea with multiple dialogues is, like we can kind of see here from this screen, we've got two display arrays. Grab my little pen here again. Two display arrays. And we're wanting the user to be able to select some things over from this array, from this part of the screen, and move it if they want to over here, and vice versa. So they can move some data here, move it back, and that wouldn't be possible with a standard singular dialogue. But with multiple dialogues, you can actually have both of these arrays, these display arrays, active at the same time so that the user can move between them, one to the other, and not have to accept or cancel to be able to do that. So to implement this idea of multiple dialogues all active at the same time, there's this new dialogue clause. And this overriding dialogue block or statement allows any other single interactive dialogues that are embedded within it to all be active at the same time. That sounds very complicated, but I think the example that they show here makes it a little bit easier to understand. All right. So this is what the code, like a little code snippet, would look like for this implementation of multiple dialogues. So if you look at it, it looks very 4GL-like. Right? We have a lot of the same types of statements we're already familiar with 4GL. We've got our function, got our end function. Here's an open window with form. And then right here is this new dialogue clause or dialogue interactive statement. And everything within, we'll just call this kind of the superset dialogue. Everything that's embedded within this dialogue and the end dialogue is going to be active at the same time. So here we have an input. Here's our first display array. Here's our second display array dialog. And all of these sub-dialogues, the input and the two display arrays, are active at the same time. So that's the way that it's implemented. So we have three sub-dialogues kind of all embedded within this overriding kind of superset dialog clause. So I think the big benefit there, the users don't have to commit, they don't have to cancel as they move through the form. There's a couple of other things here that you may not be too familiar with. We've got these action statements here, just a bunch of things that the users can do. They're very similar, though, to command statements. For example, command statements in a menu, just a bunch of stuff that the user's allowed to do. Let's see. Okay, just noticing a little chat. All right, here's another language enhancement we'll look at. This is talking a little bit about drag and drop. Drag and drop is also kind of a nice feature that we didn't have, of course, with 4GL, kind of a graphical feature that allows a user to drag information over here from, let's say, one array over to another array. So this is all implemented under the covers with two display arrays. And again, we're using the same functionality we saw in the previous example with that new dialog clause. So this is another example of multiple dialogues. And inside this overriding superset dialog, sounds kind of strange, overriding dialog clause, we have these two display arrays. So both of them, as you can see, are active at the same time, which is why we require the multiple dialogues feature. And they can drag information over here from the orders side of the screen over to the truck side of the screen. So here's a little code snippet for that. And you can see a little bit better how that was implemented. I grab a pen here. So once again, here's our dialog clause that we saw a few minutes ago. We don't see the end dialog, but it's down there somewhere. And then here is the first array. Right, so this will be a sub-dialog embedded within the overriding dialog. Here's the second array. So there we can see it's implemented there with our multiple dialog feature, and then we've embedded the two display array statements within it. Now something else to notice is that the display array has some new functionality that we haven't seen yet. Here's some new, what they call interaction blocks. This on drag start is one of these new interaction blocks. Here's another one down here. On drag enter, on drop. So all three are new, what they call interaction blocks or control blocks that we can use to control what happens when a user drags some information, maybe hovers over an area in the array on the right-hand side, and then drops the data. So that lets us put some logic in the program, for example, that would determine whether or not they're allowed to drop an item in a particular place. Something else that's new here that we'll talk a little bit about later is it's also implemented using some special new classes and methods. This drag drop class has been implemented to support drag and drop. So there's some methods in that class, like this set operation method that you see right here that allows you to specify whether the object being dragged is being copied or moved. It looks like this is the logic for a move. We've got another method down here at the very bottom, get location row, that can be used to figure out what rows that the user has selected in the drag and drop. So there's several other methods that are used to figure out what data, what row the user has dragged, what he's selected, that type of thing. So that's one of the big features, I think, for VDL is a lot of these new built-in classes and methods that you can use to manipulate objects on the screen and manage some of these new features. All right, here's another feature. This is called a tree widget. So there's lots of options for display, you'll notice, with Genero. So here's another option called a tree widget. So it's a tree container. It has expandable and collapsible nodes. Oops, so right there. We call those a tree view, by the way. And it's especially helpful for managing a large amount of data. The user can expand or collapse what it is they want to see. And there's supported triggers for on-expand, on-collapse that can be used to dynamically load or refresh the data at the point where the user is opening a folder. So that's a benefit because we don't necessarily have to traffic all the data to the front end until it's needed, like when a user clicks on a folder and the on-expand is triggered, for example. We implement this tree container with another display array. So this is another feature of display array. A lot of enhancements to the display. So this has a screen array that's bound to a tree container that has these special tree view specific attributes. And tree containers are very similar to the table containers that we saw in the example a few pages ago, except that the first columns are used to display a tree of nodes on the right of the widget. It's a little bit different. So here's I was going to say the code snippet, but this is actually the form, right? So here we're taking a look at the form. Couple of big differences here. Now this happens to be a text specification, so this is a .per file, but there's still a few differences here that are specific to Genero. So this has been customized for Genero. So this form notice uses a layout section instead of a screen section, and just that change allows us to use some of these new widgets. Things like combo boxes, progress bars, radio box, and of course the tree widget that we see for this example, since we're actually talking about tree widgets. So it's a big feature with a lot of functionality, but relatively easy for us to implement if we're familiar with 4GL, because most of this looks like 4GL code or 4GL forms, like the .per form. Per form just has some enhancements to it. And another enhancement here, they're talking a little bit about the rich text edit widget. That's hard to say fast, rich text edit widget. So this is another widget that you can add to a form, kind of like the tree containers table containers, and this is a TextEdit widget. So it has a formatting bar that has a lot of features that users are pretty familiar with. Text formatting like bold, italics, underline, paragraph alignment, left and right alignment, justify, bullets, paragraph indentation, font size. Looks like over here it's awful small, kind of hard to see, isn't it? But a lot of the features that users are very familiar with TextEdit. You can also add features down here at the bottom to your TextEdit widgets. You can add a find and replace bar, spell checker. Here you can see it's offering some options here for spelling, formatting bars, context menu. You can even include a dictionary with an application, and in that TextEdit widget we'll use the dictionary. So they're used pretty much like any other form field. Standard dialogues in your code, inputs, construct, behaves like any other field in the form, just like the container widget that we saw, the table container widget that we saw a few minutes ago. So all of those are fairly straightforward to implement. All right, something else that's available is something called multiple row selection. Just wanted to make sure I'm looking at the right thing here. So this is an example of multiple row selection. And just like you're familiar with other application in the GUI world, users sometimes want to select more than one row. So this allows users to select as many items as they want to select. And once again, this is implemented with a display array statement, more enhancements to display array, and you can turn off this multi-row selection programmatically with another new class method. So this is set selection mode, and by default, this multi-row selection feature is turned off. So users can only select one item, one row. But if you change it programmatically with this method, they can start selecting multiple rows if they want to. So you can actually turn this off or on as you like in the application. So yet another built-in method. We have a session on built-in methods coming up, or built-in classes and methods, Tuesday, July the 3rd. So if you're interested in the built-in classes and a lot of the functionality that's been added to Genero with built-in classes, you should attend that session. I think it'll be interesting. Another language enhancement is the ability to call Java from 4GL. There's a little import statement that you can use. They've shown you an example here at the top, where you can import and use your Java classes with your VDL programs. There's still some other steps, of course, that you have to do. You still have to install the Java development kit on the developer systems. You still need the Java runtime system on the production system. But the idea there is you can go ahead and use your Java classes that you're familiar with or that you have a preference for, in addition to all of these built-in classes that we have built into Genero. I'm not sure that you'll really need them that much, but the option is there. There's a lot of third-party integration with Genero, just in case you want the ability to use those third-party options. Alrighty, this switches gears more or less from looking at the enhancements, like the language enhancements, form enhancements that we've been looking at so far, and starts talking a little bit more about the architecture. And this is where I had planned to take a little break if we needed to, but We've really only been at it, I guess, about half an hour or so, 35 minutes or so. So I think we'll go ahead and keep going for a few more minutes. So now we'll focus a little bit on the architecture and something called the AUI, or Abstract User Interface. That's kind of a key part of the Genero architecture that makes it so different from your traditional 4GL architecture. So at the heart of the Genero architecture is something called the dynamic virtual machine. So they've got a good picture here of that. Right, so this thing right here in the middle is something called the dynamic virtual machine. And the dynamic virtual machine actually kind of has control of everything going on when an application runs. So when you run a Genero program, you're actually running the DVM, the dynamic virtual machine. And it creates an environment that's kind of similar to a mini operating system to run that program in. The FGL-RUM command that's used to execute a BDL application creates a DVM, and that DVM, you can see here, has everything it needs to be able to run that application. So it's got information about the database, and these pictures are so small I can't tell which side. It looks like here's the database side over here. Right, to access the database connection information, access web services if you use web services, information about the front end that you're trying to use, which I think is over here. Okay. Everything it needs to know to be able to run that application. Sometimes the DVM is referred to as the runtime system, kind of interchangeably. So if you hear somebody talk about the runtime system, like I did actually a few pages ago, they're referring to the dynamic virtual machine. And the runtime system would just be referring to that overall environment where the program runs, kind of like a mini operating system. Now here it's talking about these abstract layers up here at the top of the slide. Presentation, layer, code, data, network. So the dynamic virtual machine executes code that's kind of abstracted from all these different layers. So that kind of gets us to the abstract user interface. When the DVM connects with a client, such as a browser or a Genero desktop client, it's communicating the user interface and the components of the user interface, which are actually these XML-based nodes that kind of resemble a tree of information. So this tree is sent to the client. The client interprets that user interface tree according to the rules of whatever front end that's being used on that client. So this abstract representation of the user interface, or AUI, allows that same application to run on various front ends without changes or recompiling. So I can run it, for example, on a mobile device or run it on a desktop client without having to recompile the code. Those forms that we were looking at earlier, when you compile a form in Genero, you end up with an XML file. And in that XML file that represents the form becomes one piece of this abstract user interface. So that makes it very portable to any type of front end or any OS, because it's essentially just kind of nodes in a tree that get interpreted by that front end. And we'll talk a lot more about this here in the next several slides. So a minute ago, we said that the DVM communicates with the database. And it communicates with the database through something we call the ODI, or Open Database Interface. So that's what we're talking about up here at the top. That means that database support is another big difference between 4GL and Genero VDL. Genero is database agnostic, and through the native drivers in this Open Database Interface, the same Genero program can open database connections to any of the supported databases. So here's a list up here on the screen, not only Informix, but DB2, Oracle, Sybase, MySQL, those are all options. Statements from the application, SQL statements, are mapped by this open database interface to the database you're using. You can connect to these other databases other than Informix. You can even have more than one connection open at the same time. And you can read data from the different databases into the same application. They can be different databases. I could have a connection open to Informix and a connection open to MySQL database at the same time and read data from both of those into the same application. We have a little adaptation guide for each one of these supported databases that you can look at to see how it would map the SQL in an application to a particular database. It's not always seamless, like an application that you've written, for example, for Oracle may not work perfectly with another database, and that's what the adaptation guides will kind of help you with, kind of show you things that are supported, what's not supported, and so on. But very flexible. This kind of refers back to the idea that with this abstract user interface, we can deploy an application anywhere without having to recompile. Right, so the DVM, the dynamic virtual machine we were talking about a second ago, sends raw data to the client, and then that raw data is configured for whatever user interface that client is using. So that's pretty nice because it keeps a developer from having to worry too much about porting an application to a different front end. All these special classes or protocols or methods that might be required aren't really necessary with this architectural model because it's more or less just sending raw data along with this abstract user interface, this XML tree, to the front end, and then that front end just interprets it according to its own set of rules, so to speak. So an application created for the desktop model, let's say using our Genero desktop client. Let me see if I can write a little bit here. Not easy with this pen. Right, so we might use the Genero desktop client to run that application. And then that same application could be run with a browser using the Genero web client. We call him GWC for short. And we can even maybe use a mobile device with the same app. And again, that would be also using the Genero web client. But I mentioned earlier that we have some special themes that we'll take a look at here in a little bit more detail for mobile apps. We even have a special theme just for iPhone, since we see a picture of iPhone up here. So one of the big differences then in the architecture between 4GL and Genero is that the business logic and the user interface are separated with Genero. So you don't have to do a lot of changing or porting to the code to be able to use the same application with multiple interfaces like this. It's much simpler. And here it's just taking that a step further. You know, we saw the different front ends like a mobile device, the desktop client, the web client through a browser. But here it's just saying it also applies to operating systems as well. So it's operating system agnostic, I guess you could say. So presentation independent code. You can run on any of these front ends because of that abstract user interface. So when a program is launched, when the DVM launches a program, or when the user launches a program, that abstract user interface is built. And we talked about a form compiled with Genero is actually an XML file that becomes kind of a part of that abstract user interface. And here we can see a little bit of code up here. This form wizard form up here is no longer a compiled binary file like it is with 4GL. Now that form wizard file would be XML. And that XML file is just loaded as part of the AUI tree, the Abstract User Interface tree. So since the AUI is just XML and an XML representation of everything in the user interface, it doesn't really matter what front end or operating system we're using. It can be interpreted by any front end or any operating system without having to change the code. This is kind of a visual of what the Abstract User Interface tree looks like. You can actually do this yourself if you're curious about getting kind of a visual look at the tree. What they've done here is if you have Genero Studio, in what they call debug mode, if you start up the Genero desktop client, for example, with a -D, it kind of puts it in like a debug mode. And that gives you the ability to use the debugger with it, as well as this debug tree, they call it. If you look up here at the top, you can see it calls it a debug tree up there. And it's a nice visual of the Abstract User Interface. They're saying you can consider that kind of a logical map of the Abstract User Interface. Every single object in the user interface is represented here as kind of a node in the tree. So this compiled form that we were talking about earlier, and here we can see here's a window in our Abstract User Interface that has a form, top menus in the form, there's a toolbar, here's some special containers, horizontal box, vertical boxes, but every single item in that form, in the whole user interface for that matter, is represented here as kind of a node in the tree. So that compiled form was an XML document. That XML document becomes a DOM document. You guys familiar with DOM documents? Do me a favor, and if you've ever worked or heard of a DOM document, give me a raised hand. Anybody worked with DOM documents? Okay. A few folks look like they're familiar with it. Okay, several folks have. Okay, well that's what we're working with here. All right, so we've got this DOM document. Document Object Model is what DOM stands for, when that XML gets loaded into memory. And here we can see kind of a visual representation. Now this is read-only in the debug tree. But every single node in the tree has a set of properties, and those properties can be manipulated programmatically. So here we're able to see what the current properties are for all the objects in the AUI, the Abstract User Interface tree, and just be aware that every single object, every single node can be manipulated if you need to. Right? Programmatically using some of these special built-in classes and methods that we've already talked a little bit about. So we can hide objects on the screen, show objects, disable, enable objects on the screen by manipulating the DOM, right? By manipulating these nodes in the tree. All right. So the next session, let's see, a couple of weeks, actually it's June the 19th, we're going to have a tour of Genero Studio. And if you attend that session, one of the things we'll actually look at is we'll take a look here at the debug tree and poke around with it a little bit. We'll do a lot of demos of some of the features in Studio. And here they're just continuing on with that same thought process here. We're looking here at the XML, it looks like, from a compiled form. I'm thinking I might need some new glasses here. So here's a compiled form, right, that's been compiled with Genero. And you can see here that it's just plain old XML. So that's all part of the Abstract User Interface and very portable. So they're just showing here that that form now gets rendered maybe a little bit differently by each operating system. I've got Windows, Mac, and so on over here, Linux. every operating system, every front end may render that form a little bit differently according to the rules for that particular front end. So I think by now you've probably got the basic idea of it. Very portable and can be rendered pretty much on any front end and on any operating system, just because it's all been done in XML and gets implemented as a DOM document. All right, just a little bit more here about that abstract user interface tree, and then we'll talk a little bit here about something I think we haven't really talked about yet called the GAS, the Genero Application Server. And I think this slide makes a good introduction to it, so we'll kind of move into that architecture here as well. So just to kind of finish up our discussion on the user interface being so separated from the actual business logic of the code, it's talking here the abstract user interface is a DOM document. It's just a memory representation of the user interface. And one of the jobs of the dynamic virtual machine is to keep that AUI synchronized, that DOM document synchronized with the front end. So the communication between the two is kept in sync, and the bulk of the processing, of course, stays on the server. So they're saying it's a thin client with low graphics traffic. Now let's talk a little bit here too. This makes a good introduction, I think, to the application server. This component right here is called the GAS, the Genero Application Server. Now, as you would expect, application server means that this is kind of the engine that delivers the application. So it's the part that creates a relationship between the front ends, like our desktop client or the web client, and it creates a relationship between that front end and the DVM, the dynamic virtual machine that we've been talking about in a lot of these previous slides. So the web client, which we've talked a little bit about down here at the bottom, actually is kind of part of the application server. You get the Genero web client when you install the application server. So it's kind of considered a part of the application server. And then here you can see that the GAS, the Genero Application Server, also interfaces with a web server to handle any requests it gets, say, from the internet. Now, before we talk a little bit more about the Genero web client, we've got another page here on the desktop client. So a little bit more information about the Genero desktop client. It's a graphical front end, multi-platform. You can run it on Windows. There's a 32-bit version and a 64-bit version. It's supported for Mac, Linux, 32, 64-bit with X11. And you can run the application for the Genero desktop client through the GAS if you want to, but you still are delivering the application locally with the GDC, the Genero desktop client. You can also embed it in an HTML page with ActiveX technology. So you put it in a website, you use it with the Internet Explorer, and the first time, you've probably seen this lots of times, right? The first time you access it, it actually has to install itself on the client with this ActiveX mode, and then it creates a shortcut in the Windows Start menu. So then the GDC can be executed from the web page using that shortcut or using the URL or the shortcut. And then once a browser connects to the URL, it gets displayed in a web page. And you can use it exactly the same way as you just use the normal desktop version. So it's got a couple of implementation models that way. You can use SSH with the desktop client or HTTP through a web server. SSH is nice because it encrypts all the data. It's got the nice port forwarding feature SSH does, so that you don't have to use a lot of ports to communicate with the desktop client. So the security and reduction of ports are both a couple of nice benefits for it. Now notice up here at the top, it's talking about the Genero desktop client was built with Nokia Qt. I guess it's Qt or Cutie, I think people pronounce it. So it's kind of a nice open architecture. We have several pages here about the web client, the Genero web client. We mentioned earlier that the Genero web client, along with the abstract user interface, it's not real picky about the operating system that you're running the applications on. It's not real picky about the front end that you're using. You can run the same application on a mobile device or the desktop client. So one of the features of the Genero web client is something they call themes. We have special themes so that the application gets rendered more appropriately and looks more like a native app for iPhone, for example. There's a Silverlight theme, right, that's kind of intended for Microsoft implementations. There's an Ajax theme, which you can kind of see down here. Let me grab a pen real quick. The Ajax theme, by the way, right now is our default theme, and it pretty well works across all the browsers. Now, if you want an application to look a little bit more like let's say, a native iPhone app, you may prefer to use the iPhone theme instead of the Ajax theme, but it's portable across pretty much all the browsers. It's specifically intended for browsers like Firefox or Chrome, Opera, Safari. So again, works pretty well with iPhone, but there is a special iPhone theme. And Scott reminds me, I need to mention that there's an HTML5 theme as well. That's our newest theme, and eventually will replace the Ajax theme as the default. Now right now the Ajax theme is just kind of our generic web theme. When you're in Studio, for example, if you pick web, you're using the Ajax theme. But HTML5 is getting more and more standardized and evolving, and in the next major release of Genero, that Ajax default will be replaced with the HTML5 as the default, and eventually the Ajax theme will be discontinued, or at least our support will be discontinued for the Ajax theme, but not right now. Right now the Ajax theme is still the default, but the HTML5 theme is available kind of in a preview mode where you can try it out, get a feel for what everything looks like with it, start using it perhaps. Let's see, what else should I say here about the Genero web client? We have several more pages on it. This infinite customization is referring to customizing the way the application's rendered to perhaps make it look a little bit more like a native iPhone app, for example. And we have some best practices for customizing. We prefer that you customize first with what we call Genero presentation styles. Presentation styles kind of allow you to centralize your properties that you would decorate a particular graphical object with. So it kind of gives you a way to set up some attributes in a centralized file. And then that centralized file can be used with, let's say, all your applications, so that you don't have to worry about missing one or accidentally forgetting a special attribute in a particular application. You can just instead use this kind of centralized style file. There is a default style file, and it's got properties in there, or default properties, for example, for things like background colors, foreground colors, fonts, that type of things. But you can actually create your own kind of customized style file if you want to, and you can load that in an application, and that will override the default styles file. So that's kind of the first idea with customizing, is to try to use something that's centralized, like these presentation styles that Genero supports, And that way you don't have to do as much customization on the individual applications. You can just kind of do it from a centralized file. And if you want to make a change, you make it to the file, and you don't have to go out and touch each one of these separate applications. They recommend that first, right, using these presentation styles. And then from that level, you might try CSS, cascading style sheets. Then, if you still need more customization, maybe actually editing these special templates and snippet files that come with our Genero product, Genero Web Client. And then finally, I guess your lowest level of customization would be something like JavaScript, if you wanted to get down to that level. So you can use any or all of those methods. They're not mutually exclusive, but we kind of recommend you start with something like a presentation style method first so that you can centralize the changes. Kind of give everything the same look and feel. And here's a few more pages here on the Genero Web Client, just talking a little bit about some of these specialized themes we have for some of the different browsers. Here we're talking a little bit about the Ajax theme. Ajax theme, I mentioned, I believe, that it was based on JavaScript. Something else about the Ajax theme, if you try it out, you'll notice that it has a kind of a look and feel that's pretty close to the Genero desktop client. It gives you kind of a similar rendering for the application. It works pretty well across all the different browsers, so that's again why it's the default. But again, like Scott mentioned, eventually it will be replaced with the HTML5 theme, which is kind of rapidly becoming more popular and getting more standardized. So the Ajax theme will still be around for a while until that HTML5 theme, I guess, becomes firmly entrenched with everyone, and then eventually the Ajax theme will be unsupported, and we'll be moving everything, I guess, that was Ajax over to HTML5. Now there's two maps for Ajax, one for Internet Explorer. There's like a specific one for Internet Explorer and then a different one for everything that's not Internet Explorer. So it actually, I guess they had to split it off a little bit because of the differences between Internet Explorer and everybody else. Mentioned a minute ago, I think, that there's a special theme for the Genero Web Client for Microsoft Silverlight. And that Silverlight theme provides templates, snippet sets based on Silverlight components, XAML, C#. So more or less the technology behind Silverlight to make it look like a native Silverlight application. We talked a little bit about the iPhone theme. So here it's just pointing out that you actually have two Genero Web Client options for iPhone support. You can use the Ajax theme if you want to with iPhone, and everything should be rendered pretty well. But if you prefer it to look more like a native iPhone app, then you can try the iPhone theme. So it renders the interface more like a native iPhone application. Here's a little detail on the application server and how we deploy these applications and what happens when an application is launched. So a little bit more about the GAS architecture. So let's start, maybe grab a pen here. Start over here on the far left, I think would be a good place. So over here, let's say the end user launches, there we go. He uses a URL to specify the application he wants to run. So that's what that's supposed to be. Right. So via a shortcut or just typing it in. And that gets, of course, routed by the web server to what we call the gas dispatcher, or to a gas dispatcher. Now the gas dispatcher is talking about these, they call them connectors too, so I kind of use the term interchangeably. I don't know if I'm supposed to, but I think of a dispatcher and a connector as kind of the same thing. So there's different dispatchers or connectors for each type of web server. You can kind of see a list of them down here at the bottom. So there's a CGI dispatcher, or fast CGI is also supported for CGI compliant web servers like Apache, for example. So there's a special dispatcher for that, anything CGI based. There's an ISAPI dispatcher for IIS, right, for your Windows web servers. And there's also a Java servlet dispatcher for Java servlet-based web servers. Something like, I think, Tomcat, for example, is Java servlet-based. So there's 3 different types of dispatchers out there. Typically, you'll only be using one type of dispatcher. So that the dispatcher is responsible for routing the request to what they call a proxy process. And every session, every user session, results in a separate proxy process. So it's pretty common to see a lot of these out there if you're running multiple sessions. And there'll be a different type of proxy for the application that's being requested, the different front ends. For example, there might be GDC proxies, right? When folks are using the GDC, the Genero desktop client. Whew, that's too hard to type in, so I'm just going to leave it at that. So GDC proxy, there might be a GWC proxy. That would be your web client. So folks coming in with the web client would start up a GWC proxy. And we'll talk a little bit about web services in a few minutes. So if web services is in use, you would even see maybe some GWS proxies for web services. So there'll be different types of proxies based on the types of requests that are coming in. So that gas dispatcher then kicks off these proxies, and the proxies are handling these requests. And then the dispatcher is also responsible for tracking those until the application ends. So the benefit to that is this dispatcher actually keeps like a persistent table. I guess you could call it a session table out here. So if anything happens, like a dispatcher gets killed and gets restarted again, he can use that session table out there to go ahead and restart the proxy process and kind of resume connection with that session. So a little bit of reliability built into it. So the VM proxy is responsible, here we're finally down to the level of launching the dynamic virtual machine. So these proxies kick off a DVM, right, and there'll be a DVM for each session. And then the proxy hangs around to kind of maintain that connection with the DVM and handle any child DVMs or keep the connections going. And then the DVM, we're missing one little spot out here. I'll just add one. May also be communicating on its side with the database. Very poor drawing, but looks more like a musical note than a database, doesn't it? But in any case, if necessary, if you're using a database, then the DVM will be communicating with the database as well. So it's working with the proxies on one side, which would be kind of your representation of the application server, the GAS, and then it's communicating with databases on the other side. So there's a little bit more about the GAS architecture. Trying to think if there's anything else really exciting I can think of. I can't really think of anything, so let's see what we've got coming. All right, so they're switching gears here with web components. So this is a little bit more about third-party integration with Genero. There might be some third-party widgets out there that you find really interesting. Like they've got an example here in this picture of something called Fusion Charts. It has some really nice looking graphs that you might want to integrate into your applications. So Genero supports something called web components so that you can do that as of version 2.30. So you can integrate these third-party graphical components into your form files. There's a new form item type called web component, and you can integrate charts, graph widgets, calendar widgets, drawing widgets, things that aren't part of our standard Genero toolkit by integrating with these third parties. Some of them are freebies, some of them are licensed, and I guess we kind of leave that up to you, right, to figure that out, whether it's licensed web components that you're using from these third-party vendors or freebie components. So this kind of simplifies it, the idea of just using this special widget in a form called a web component. But the idea is you can just add this widget into your form as this special new type called web component, and the properties of that web component widget specify how to communicate with the widget, how to use this third-party technology the way it's designed. There's a couple more steps. You do have to implement a little interface script as a one-time thing on the front end. You do have to define the web component field, and then you have to use the web component in your application. But it's fairly straightforward, and again, pretty 4GL-like, but just with some new widgets, for example, that you use in the form. And we have a few more pages here. I think we're on the downhill stretch, but another page or two here on something called web services, which is getting to be more and more popular. I know that some of us are probably using web services without even knowing we're using web services. Like, for example, I like to go out and get stock quotes, and it's a big possibility that when I go out and enter a stock quote and submit it, that I might be actually using web services underneath the covers. So it's turning into a pretty popular technology. Just out of curiosity, are any of you guys using web services? Anybody doing any programming in web services? Give me a hand up if anybody's using web services. Anybody? Oh, several people are. Okay. Charles and Ed, Joe. Alrighty, very good. So it's becoming more and more popular. You can use web services with Genero. Everything you need to be a web service provider or consumer is built into our Genero Web Services extension. So let's talk a little bit about web services and kind of what they're intended for and how we implement them. So the basic idea with web services is we may want to exchange data between different companies on different platforms with different programming languages, and we might want to do that in kind of a safe and secure way. And that's kind of the basis of the idea behind web services. So it's just kind of a platform-neutral way to connect multiple systems over the internet or an intranet in some cases. And that allows applications like maybe a .NET application, for example, to communicate with, let's say, a BDL program and be able to exchange information, like my stock quote example, for example. It's based on something called SOA, or SOA, which stands for Service-Oriented Architecture. And SOA is just a set of principles or guidelines for designing and developing software to connect systems and exchange data. So it's kind of a standard for defining services and services that you would use as a programmer for providing web service information to other folks that want to consume that service information. So we have the SOA Foundation. It's kind of the guiding principles and the methodologies. And then web services are kind of the way we implement these definitions for services to be provided. So the whole idea comes down to trying to enable communication between two entities, and that would be your server that has some kind of a service that he wants to share or expose, and a client that wants to consume those services. So web services, like a lot of the things we've talked about today, work by using XML. And so they answer requests for information about a service by returning some kind of a structured XML document. Doesn't matter what platforms are used for the server or the client because it's XML. And we're using HTTP with it as well. So HTTP and XML are both kind of agnostic. So that makes it kind of platform neutral or platform independent. All right, just a little bit more here. So the way that web services defines exactly how to ask for information that's provided by a service in an XML document is using something called a Web Services Descriptive Language document, or WSDL for short. So it's just a little XML document that it uses, and that's the way it defines exactly what the service is and how to access the service. So there's several steps to setting up a web service. The first step would just be to build the web service with whatever your favorite programming language is and expose it. You have to generate a client stub from the WSDL. The client formulates a SOAP request based on the WSDL specifications. Web service forwards that request to a web service request handler. The request handler parses the SOAP request, invokes the web service, and creates the SOAP response. And then the web server passes that SOAP response back to the client as part of the HTTP response. So our web services extension that comes with Genero supports all the open standards for working with web services: XML, HTTP, SOAP, UDDI, and so on. And you can call web services from any VDL client. It doesn't have to be the web client. It can be the desktop client. You can use them between heterogeneous programs. It doesn't have to be VDL programs. You could be using a .NET program talking to maybe your VDL web service. And it does require GAS. Notice that they've got GAS here for deployment. You can leave out the GAS component while you're working on it as far as development, but when you deploy it, it does require the GAS, the application server, to manage the web services. Okay. I think that's just about it as far as just a little overview on the architecture. I wanted to make sure you understood a little bit about the application server and, of course, the abstract user interface. Those were the two big goals of today's session. And also, we went over some of the language enhancements early on in the session just to kind of give you a taste of some of the feature set that you could use to kind of enhance your legacy 4GL applications and make them a little bit more modern and mobile if you wanted to. I put together this last little slide. Someone did this for me when I started, and I found it very helpful. This may be old information for you guys, but just thought I might throw it out here just in case there's some folks that are a little bit unfamiliar with the file extensions. So let's go through these. This will be kind of the last topic here we talk about as far as the architecture today. So down here I'll start with the .per file. We saw earlier in some of the examples when we were looking at the language enhancements that you can use your .per files and just update those .per files. And then when you compile those per files with Genero, they end up having a .42f extension. And if you remember that .24f extension, or when a file is compiled with Genero, we talked about it being converted or translated to XML. So that .42f up there is a compiled Genero form that's now in an XML format. And we talked about how nice that is for using that for the abstract user interface and being able to pretty much port it to any front end or any operating system because it's in this nice XML format. These .4fds that we hear over here on the left of the .per file are forms that have been created with the Form Designer in Studio. So the FD stands for Form Designer. So these .4fds are more graphical representations of the form. And those too, when they're compiled, have the .42f extension because they also then are translated into XML. 4GL files, when they're compiled under Genero, become .42m extensions. Right? So .42m is a compiled 4GL file. And then up here at the very top of my little kind of a tree structure is the .42r, which stands for runnable. So that runnable file then has all the modules linked to it. So just kind of a little background there on some of the file extensions. In the next session on Studio, I'll kind of do the same thing at the end of the session and put together a little list of acronyms that we might have talked about during the session. GST, for example, stands for Genero Studio, that type of acronym. All right, so that's the end of our presentation. We don't have any additional slides to look at. So let me get rid of my pen here. And that leaves us open for question and answer time. We did finish a little bit earlier than I expected. I didn't think we'd really need 2 hours, but you never know. And we don't know what kind of questions we might have either. Anybody have any questions? I'm going to watch for a raised hand. And if anybody has a raised hand, then I'll go ahead and open up your microphone so that you can ask your question, or you can feel free to send it to me by chat as well. Okay, well, I don't see any questions. Let me just ask Scott real quick if there's anything he would like to add before we close the session. Oh, Debbie found a typo. Thank you, Debbie. I appreciate it. I'll fix that before the next session. Thank you. You're welcome. Okay, Scott says he has nothing to add. All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for attending the session. As you probably noticed, this session was just an overview of some of the feature enhancements and some of the kind of special architecture for Genero. Next session will be Tuesday, June the 19th, and that will be kind of a tour of the Genero Studio development environment. I hope you guys will join us for that session as well. Remember, we did record the session and we're going to post it. What we plan to do later this afternoon, or worst case scenario, first thing in the morning, will be to post the link to the recording out there where the Register Now link was on our instructor-led training site. So look for it there, and I'll also try to make sure I send it to you as a link in a follow-up email today for you folks that were able to attend the entire session. So thank you very much, and I hope I see you the 19th in our tour of Genero Studio. Have a good day.